Okay. So welcome to Digital Media Production. And today we have with us a special guest, Al Dukes of WFAN Sports Talk Radio in New York.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining class.
Smattering of applause.
I'll give you here. I'll give you a nice emoji reaction.
Okay.
Here's an applause. There you go.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. So the reason why, Al, I wanted to ask you to join us today is because you have such extensive experience, not just in radio, but also with podcasting. And this week, and actually for the next 2 weeks, students in digital media production have been assigned they have to come up with a topic for a podcast. They have to do an outline for the podcast, identify the target audience, the format for the podcast. So whether that's a talk podcast, an interview based podcast, a monologue, and then identify a genre where that podcast will fit, and then record and edit their own podcast for distribution. So maybe you can tell everybody, Al, a little bit about yourself and how long you've been involved in radio and the audio industry, and maybe how it's changed over those 20 years.
All right. Yeah, I've been in talk radio in some form of or another since 1995, I will say, right? So that's 2005, 2015. Yeah, so 25 years, yeah. And in that time, I worked mostly in sports talk, but I've also worked in general sort of entertainment talk, or what they call guy talk, what they used to call guy talk, FM talk, that sort of thing. But now I work sports radio. I produce the morning show, host a 1 hour show as well every day, and I host a podcast every day as well. Those tend to be not as much real sports as much as it is the lifestyle of sports, what's going on in the players' lives, or what odd stories have come out of the games, that sort of thing. So when I first got into this, radio was the only thing out there really for people to hear talk radio or talk subjects and interviews and that sort of thing. But of course, over the years with podcasts, now there are 8 million of them.
Right, 1 million of them, which is why I wanted to
Yes.
have you on today, because there are 1 million of them. And I want to ask you, you've been in radio for a very long time, and that's a very quick history, but you really are, you've been a producer at WFAN for 14 years now, but involved in radio for many more before that. And I remember when I was in graduate school and somebody was studying radio, I thought, oh, why would you want to study radio? Why not television? So first, let's just start with why radio and not TV. How does radio really differ from an audience perspective and an experience, and the listening experience?
Well, for me, I grew up listening to Howard Stern, and he always used to talk about why he got into radio, because he would listen to the radio and there was never anything exciting going on. He thought, well, I could do that. And I felt the same way. I thought TV seems like real stars go there, and it seems like a lot of work gets put into these TV shows. And radio to me felt like, a lot of times this is a media that you consume by yourself, right? A lot of times it's listened to in the car. You're normally by yourself coming to and from work. If you're out running or exercising, again, it's in your ears. You're consuming it by yourself. So it's a more intimate medium. It is something that, to me, if you had an idea for a TV show, the moment you got that idea till it actually got on TV, if it ever did, would probably be years in the making. Where radio, if I have an idea right now, in a couple hours, I can have that idea on the air. So it's a very immediate reaction type medium. And also the one where I feel like people most are themselves, because you are, like I said, you're listening to it by yourself. We're on for many hours a day, 4 or 5 hours a day. You really get to know somebody that way. And it's hard to be an actor for those 5 hours. So your real personality tends to come out. So that's what drew me to it.
And do you think that being on air has helped you with the podcasting, or gave you the idea for the podcasting? Like, why did you even start a podcast? You're already a known entity. You're on the air. People already know you. Why even bother?
Well, at the time on the radio, I was a guy who was sort of the third or fourth microphone on a show. So I didn't talk a lot, but I talked some, and I was known, but uh, I wasn't my own show, right? So there were people that liked me on the show, but I wasn't on a lot. And the company back in 2015 saw that podcasting would certainly be in the future. So they had asked us, hey, if anyone's interested in doing a podcast, if you have some ideas, let us know and let's get some podcasts going. So back then I thought that is a great idea. I'll get involved that way. But in doing it for the 5 years or so, or I did it probably for 3 years, 3 or 4 years before I was given my own 1 hour show on the radio station. And with the same guy I was doing the podcast with. So we built up over that time our chemistry so that when we got on the actual radio, we already had a good rapport from having done the podcast for a couple of years already.
So the CBS, it was CBS Radio at the time, came to the talent and the producers and said, "Hey, we're looking for some podcasts. We're trying to break into this area of
Yeah.
audio."
And in fact, they went to people like me who are like the second tier, known to the audience, but not the main talk show host, right? So the main talk show hosts are busy doing 4 and 5 hour shows. That's a lot every day. That's 20 hours, 25 hours a week that they're putting out content. So they came to some of the other people that work on the shows that have a microphone on the show, but aren't the dominant personality on the show and said, do you have ideas? What are you interested in doing? And let's see if it fits for what we want to do with podcasting.
So you had the podcast with Jerry, which is called the Warm Up Podcast.
Well, we called it at the time the post game podcast because we would do it after the show that we worked on. That show went off the air at 10 a.m. Then Jerry and I, originally the idea was we were going to talk about things that we never got to on the regular show. But then it sort of evolved into our own personalities and we started bringing up topics that we wouldn't do on the regular show because the regular show really was sports, and we started doing sort of other fun topics that didn't necessarily fit with the sports show.
Now that's the one podcast, and that's still in existence, and you still still host and produce that with Jerry.
Right.
It goes out, comes out every single day. What about your other podcast, Al's Boring Podcast?
Well, my original podcast idea was I wanted to interview people in the media. You know, I thought there's a lot of people interviewing celebrities in TV and movies, but you know, where the people in the radio are celebrities, much lower level, and they don't get asked to be on like the David Letterman show or the Tonight Show or Jimmy Fallon. No one's interested. But I thought they all had compelling stories to tell, and I thought it would also be interesting for students to be able to hear stories on how did someone get that job that they have, like what were the steps they took to get there, because that is something that when I was going to college and interested in radio, I would have loved to have had something available like that to listen
Right.
to.
And how long did it go on with the podcast that was interview based?
I probably did it for a year and a half. And then what happened was I ran out of people I was interested in talking to, or the people that I was interested in talking to didn't have any interest in speaking to me about it. That's kind of how it kind of ran its course.
Did you find it challenging toward the end to get interviews, to get people to say yes?
I did. Yes, I did find that to be the case. Yes, some people, and this was also, I think, earlier on, not that we were early on in the podcast world by any means, but it wasn't like it is today where there's a million podcasts. There was starting to be a bunch of podcasts. And what happened was, I was doing this podcast interviewing media types, and then Sports Illustrated, a very big name in the sports world, started doing their own media-based podcast. And then that guy was getting much bigger names. And I just thought, well, I've interviewed who I was interested in interviewing. This is now known as the Media Podcast because he had a much bigger platform at the time, Sports Illustrated. So I just kind of was getting bored of it, and I talked to everybody I wanted to talk to. And then there were a handful of people I really wanted to talk to that were, I guess, too shy to do it, didn't want to do an in-depth hour-long interview.
Right. Right, because they were long interviews. Can you talk about, so students, because they're preparing their podcasts, and students usually select the interview as the go-to format because on the surface, it appears like that's the easier type of podcast to produce. You don't have to maybe be as prepared. So can you speak to the preparation and the time commitment that's really involved with an interview-based podcast where you're interviewing different people every week?
Yeah, I tried to do some research on the person, like where are they working now? Where did they work just before that? Where did they work just before that? Where did they go to school? And then I liked to do it only because, as a consumer of interview podcasts, I like it to run in a linear fashion. So it's like, well, where did you grow up? When did you first have an interest in being on TV? Where did you go to school? What did you study? What was your first job out of college? Where did you go from there? And back up to where we are now. So that's the way I prefer to listen to interviews, but I also try to be careful not to spend too much time in one part that might not be interesting to the audience. So while I think in an interview podcast, it's interesting to say, how did you get into this? Where did you go to school? I really do want to get to the meat of it, which is, how did you get your first job? What is your daily routine like for these jobs? And I get frustrated as a listener to podcasts if it's somebody I'm very interested in and the podcaster gets caught up on the person's childhood for like 45 minutes, and it's like, then they run out of time, and I go, no, I appreciate a little background information, but I really wanted to hear, more about their latter day work instead of all the, getting
Right.
caught up in the childhood stuff.
So can you just briefly mention some of the people that you interviewed for your podcast, because they are very, I think, big names in the radio industry
Hmm. Do you
and
remember
TV?
any of them? I
Kim
don't.
Jones,
Kim
broadcast.
Jones. Okay. All right. So
Yep.
that was a good
Mark
one. So,
Chernoff. That was two parts. Very excellent interview about
right.
radio itself. And
Yeah. So I tried to find, yeah, you're right. I tried to find different things. So Kim Jones, uh, a female in sports broadcasting, which when she got into it, it was, there were not a lot of females in sports broadcasting. So she faced the different challenges. Then she did, the beginning of her career was baseball, covering the Yankees, and now covering the NFL. So she covered two completely different sports, which I thought was interesting, right?
Mhm.
So then I talked to radio guys that had spent their whole career in radio, other radio guys that had done um, other jobs prior to becoming a host, like maybe they were a professional sports athlete. So I tried to find people that might have different stories about how they got to where they are today.
Great. And then where did that podcast? So you stopped doing the interviews and then you started doing another podcast with your friend Paul. Can you talk a little bit about that and the change of the
Yeah.
format?
So I was feeling a lot of pressure every week to come up with an interesting guest, you know, and I started to think I want to have more control over my content. So I didn't want to have to count on somebody else to say yes to an interview and then count on somebody else to be interesting enough to have a following to get people to listen to my
Right.
podcast. So I thought, if people like me, or they wouldn't be listening in the first place. So I thought, well, if I did a podcast with my friend and we just picked one topic every week that we really dug into for 45 minutes to an hour, it would be more consistent. Because what I was finding is, and I think all podcasters who do interview based podcasts will find, is that your number of downloads or listens is going to be based on who your guest is. So if you have a big name guest one week, you're going to have a lot. If you have a guest that, even though they may have an interesting and very compelling story and interview, people might not even give it a chance because they're not familiar with that person, or that person doesn't have a large enough following. So then you'd be up and down with the audience. I wanted to have a consistent audience where I knew like every week I'd get, say, 8,000 downloads, right? As opposed to 2,000 one week, 15,000 another week, down to 1,000 the next week. I wanted it to be more consistent because I was looking at that time for advertising, and I wanted to be able to show advertisers that this podcast consistently gets 8,000 to 10,000 downloads a week. and this is generally what we talk about and who we talk to.
And what was the format? Like, how did you prepare for that podcast? So you picked a topic and then you would both separately prepare?
Yes. So, right. We would pick a topic. We might think about, I'm trying to think of some of the dumb things we did. You know, they were kind of Seinfeld-ish daily observation type podcasts. Like we might do the pizza podcast, right? And then we would each separately prepare for talking about pizza. What are toppings are acceptable? What's some weird toppings? Pizza in different parts of the country. Ordering pizza. Do you fold the pizza when you eat it? Do you, there's a million things.
Cut it with
and
a knife, right?
Yeah, we each prepared it. Do you eat cold pizza the next day or do you reheat it?
Right.
As silly as that is, we'd be able to talk 45 minutes on one topic like that. So yeah, he would prepare his notes. I would prepare my notes, and then we'd kind of just go from there.
And how long did that podcast format then have a run? How long did you do that?
I think we did that for 2 or 3 years, actually.
Yeah. And then
we simply, my friend Paul, we had different work schedules. So he was working, he was getting home at 7:00 at night from his regular day job. And I go to bed at like 7:00 at night because I wake up at like 2:30, 3:00 in the morning. So that part was getting difficult. We were running out of topics. I would have topics that I thought would last for an hour and he didn't agree and didn't want to do them. Then he would have topics that he thought would be good for an hour that I didn't think had any juice to them or legs to them. And we're just like, we did it. It's fine. Let's move on. So that's right. It just kind of ran its course.
Okay. So great. I'm glad that you said that. Now I wanted to get back.
And I got to say, the fact that it, there's something to be said for like it just ending something sooner than later, because people still reach out to me about that podcast as if it was some really great podcast. And I think part of the reason is that we cut it off before it got old.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's something to think about when you're identifying a topic, identifying a format. Is this a sustainable podcast?
Yes.
Because I really do like the idea of students learning how to do something and then planting the seed where this might be something they can then continue with. I want to talk about, and you did mention it before, advertising. How important is advertising to podcasting, and how do you get advertisers? Like, so, working for CBS and now, which is now Entercom bought CBS Radio, do you get paid? Are there sponsors? Like, how does that digital side of it work?
Well, normally I think what happens in most places with podcasts, unless you're a big name celebrity from another medium, right? Like, let's say if Brad Pitt started to do a podcast, he would be getting paid immediately because otherwise he wouldn't do it. But for most podcasters, you have to do it. You have to do the podcast consistently, which means if you put one out on Tuesday, in order to build an audience, you better put one out the following Tuesday and the following Tuesday, right? At the same time, because it becomes part of the person's daily or weekly habit. I know on Tuesdays at 10 a.m., this podcast is ready and I listen to it on my lunch hour on Tuesday. So if it's there Tuesday at 2 p.m., I missed my lunch hour. That person may not listen to your podcast that week. So it's got to be something consistent that you can build an audience if it's there week in and week out, and the audience knows what they're going to get when they download your podcast. Mm-hmm. The other thing I also liked about the topic podcast I do with my friend, as opposed to the interview. You knew every week what you were getting. It didn't change. Where some interview podcasts, and there's some very popular ones, I look at it and I'm only going to listen to it if I'm interested in the person being interviewed. So, yeah. So, and then the other thing is, if you were able to build an audience, podcast advertising now comes through podcast companies. So you would try to hook up with a company that deals in podcasts, because then what they can do is sell advertising on a group of podcasts. So let's say a podcasting company owns 10 shows and all 10 shows are aimed at, let's say, a male demographic. Well, they can find an advertiser like a shaving kid, razor blades, male deodorant, and they can get that on all of their podcasts, right? So they could spread it around. And then normally what you do is you split it. It's a lot of times like a 50-50 situation. So if somebody got $1,000 for the advertising buy, the host would get 500, the company would get 500.
Mhm. Well, what about individuals? Like if, I start have a podcast, how do I get an advertiser? Is it hard to do that? So when it
I
was
would say
just
it's
you and
all,
Mhm.
yeah,
Go ahead.
it's almost impossible. I think it's very difficult. I mean, unless you do something that's so wildly popular that a podcasting company wants to take you on as a client and sell advertising for you.
Mhm.
Or listen, you can do it yourself, but I mean, you could sell your own advertising, but I
Which
think that would have to be something very specific, right?
Right, which then,
So,
well, two things I hear you saying, and I want to emphasize to the students. One is you really need to know and identify who your target audience is. That's
right,
very important. Who is going to listen to this?
right.
Not just from an advertising perspective, but where do you find your listening audience? Where are they? So the thing that I wanted to talk to you about is number of downloads. What is a good number of downloads for a podcast, do you think? In today's environment, in 2021, where there's legitimately tens of thousands of podcasts.
I don't have a good answer for that because it would depend on what your topics are, right? So if you do something very, very specific, let's say I live in Bradley Beach, New Jersey. If I was going to do a podcast and every week I talked about what was going on in Bradley Beach, New Jersey, I have a very small audience, right? People that are also living in Bradley Beach, New Jersey.
Right.
So I'm not going to have a worldwide audience or a statewide audience. I'm going to have an audience in Bradley Beach, but that's going to be a dedicated audience, right? So even if I have 100 people that live into town and 100 people listen to this podcast every week, I would consider that successful, right? I could also then go out for advertising. I've now narrowed it down. My audience is people who live in Bradley Beach. Oh, so I could probably go door to door to restaurants and stores in Bradley Beach and say, hey, I do a Bradley Beach podcast every week. We talk about what's going on in Bradley Beach. Would you be interested in advertising? We would do a 30-second read about your restaurant. And, now I've identified advertisers who are not going to advertise anywhere else, probably. Why would a local Bradley Beach restaurant advertise anywhere but in Bradley Beach? Because that's where his or her customers are as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I think sometimes we get caught up in numbers where really, to me, it's not the total number of people, but how dedicated is your audience? How special is your audience? So I think doing something simple like that, you have a small dedicated audience, right?
Right.
I adopted a greyhound, a racing greyhound. Dog used to race. So that's a very dedicated group of people as well, people who adopt specifically greyhounds. So that specific dog has their own special needs when it comes to food, exercise, ownership. If I just focused on that, my audience is people that also have greyhounds or people that are thinking about getting a greyhound, right? So again, I might not have a huge audience, but I have a place for these people to go where they can't get that information anywhere else. And now I can go to an advertiser and say, oh, you sell, a chew toy specifically made for a greyhound's mouth because it's a long snoot. And that person's not going to want to waste their money advertising to a wide audience that doesn't have greyhounds. They'd rather advertise to a small audience of people that do have greyhounds. So a lot of it is just with the podcast, to me, is narrowing it down to find a topic that you're passionate about, that there is a dedicated audience that is not being served elsewhere. And you're going to talk to those people and you're going to find advertisers that also want to talk to those people. So that'd be my way of trying to find something interesting to do.
Right.
Topic wise.
I think we have another student joining us. Hi, Alex.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'm just getting off work. I'm sorry to interrupt like this.
That's okay. Welcome. It's all good.
Welcome.
Al was just talking about, really what you were talking about, Al, is getting very niche, very niche
Yeah,
with your topic, being very, very specific and really serving a population or community that no one else is serving. And that's the one way to really break into podcasting. I think the mistake that a lot of people make is they go really broad. They think
right.
everybody's their audience or everybody from the ages of 30 to 45, and that's not what it might be, but you really need to narrow, not micro targeting, coming up with a topic that's very, very specific.
Yeah, they say like the difference, right? So radio is a mass medium, meaning you've got to put things on there that overwhelmingly the masses like, the most people like it, right? And that's not the case with podcasts. Podcasts really should, to me, be very specific.
So just to kind of follow up with that, on the radio, you talk Jets, Giants, you talk Mets, Yankees, but not a lot of hockey, even though
Right.
one of the hosts of the show, Boomer Esiason, loves hockey because hockey does not attract a general broad audience in the demographic of men between, however, what's the demo? 35 to
Our demographic, 25 to 54, men. Okay. 25, 54. That's who that radio station is trying to reach.
For sports talk.
And it's local sports talk. But right. So hockey is not, we got too many other sports that are more popular than hockey. But if somebody did a hockey podcast, there's enough people in our area, even if you just did a New York Rangers hockey podcast, there's enough people in the area that would be interested in that. And I'm sure there are many dedicated New York Rangers podcasts.
What about what do you think makes for a good podcast versus what's just a crappy I'm sorry for the word, but something that you're like, oh, this is just awful.
Well, I think one person talking to themselves is not very entertaining, right? So just one person talking to me is boring. If you're going to have a partner that you speak to every week, then the most important thing over everything is the chemistry that you have. What is your rapport? How do you guys interact? It should be very smooth, flowing. It doesn't feel forced. I don't like anybody reading stuff unless you're reading something to set something up. It should be very conversational. And if you're going to have a guest, if you're going to host by yourself and have a guest every week, that guest also has to be entertaining. And you should have good rapport with the guests, because otherwise it's going to be not interesting. Also, to me, and I don't know, younger people don't seem to be bothered by this as much, maybe because I'm older and I've worked in professional broadcasting for a long time. Audio quality to me is so important. So if your guest is on a bad phone line, a speaker phone where you can barely hear them, all that stuff bugs me, and I will bail. The minute I hear a bad phone connection, I'm gone. I can't tolerate it. So I think all that stuff's important too.
I agree with you. In fact, audio is so important to me. I really liked Gary Vee, as you know, and there were a number of podcasts where the audio quality was so bad with his guests and just him talking, because they were just recording as much content as they could. I was like, I cannot listen to this. Even if the content is good, it's just so hard to hear him. And so one of the things students in class are learning to do is use Audition and editing. So can I just talk to you about your intro and your outro for your podcast? Did you come up with those? Where did they come from? Did the station do it?
The ones that I was doing on my own, I just came up with the intros. I would just play a little music in the beginning, and then I would just introduce it the same way every time, and we'd end it the same way every time. Introduce ourselves, and have a thing at the end that we would do. So yeah, it was just like any show you watch. There's a intro, body of the show, and then the end of it. Proper way to end it to let people know it's over.
What about podcasts that are more serial, like the true crimes podcasts, or we were talking about one you were listening to, I can't remember who, it was about a murder, and it was a short series.
It was about the JonBenet Ramsey murder from the mid 90s. That one. Yeah, go ahead. What was your question?
No, what do you think about that format for podcasts?
I've listened to a lot of podcasts that I want to like, but I don't for one reason or another. And that one I enjoyed because I thought the guests had things written. I mean, the host had things written down that were important to the story, like evidence and that sort of thing for the murder case. But then they also spoke very conversationally. You could tell they knew each other. They worked together on crime cases before. So I did like that. I tried some other podcasts, which were crime podcasts that are very highly rated. I mean, I'm talking top 10 on the iTunes charts that I couldn't get through that for one reason or another. I felt like they were reading to me. But again, when I look at things like that, I think, well, this is a very highly rated podcast. It's getting a lot of downloads. I think as younger people are not so specific with having to have the audio quality be a certain way and having the narrative to go a certain way. Like, I think me working in radio for all these years
Right.
makes everything that goes through my ears goes through with a radio filter,
Right.
which is not necessarily a podcast thing or how we
Right.
see things on TikTok, or it's so I feel a little out of the loop with that. But just for my own personal taste, I tend to like podcasts that sound like talk radio shows.
I agree with you. And I think one of the things that might happen is, as there's just so much content, that the quality of that content is going to make a difference. It just is. There's too many things to listen to. There's too many things to watch. And it will become more and more important that there's at least a baseline of understanding the audio is clean, the voices are robust. They did something to it to make it sound good. They set themselves up properly, not using the native microphone on their, computers or desktop, that there
Right.
was some care taken into the production of it. So I agree with you there. So we have two students here. Do either of you have any questions for Al as we move into the podcast unit?
Sorry, I'm doing this on my mobile phone, so I don't know. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we
We
can.
can.
Oh, hi everyone. Hi Al.
Hi.
Nice to virtually meet you through the phone. And thanks
Yes,
for
likewise.
doing this. Just a general question. You had said when you were listening to podcasts that your tolerance level for the audio is not high when it's really bad. What is the Zoom culture and this whole pandemic done for the podcasts that you frequently listen to? Are they keeping up with good audio? Because I have yet to find any that have done the Zoom interview well, and I'm just curious if you know of any.
Yeah, well, that's a great point because it's super annoying. I agree. The Zoom, what needs to happen, and I actually found that in the beginning, like the Howard Stern show that's on Sirius XM, though he's not a podcast, he'll put his interviews on the Sirius XM app, and I treat them like a podcast, right? I download it, I listen to an interview. And in the beginning of the pandemic, the interviews were really horrendous. And I think that the Howard Stern show staff actually did a lot of work before interviews now, where they ran tests with their interview subject prior to say, listen, you got to get a headset mic, or you got to have a mic that you're talking into. You can't be 5 feet away from your iPad and use that microphone. Like, I really think that they took steps towards that because they vastly improved. And I also know, like, when they were having some glitches after that, he'd be yelling at the people on his show that should have had this cleared up prior. So I think they went to a lot of work to do that. And I also think now that as celebrities in particular are doing more of their promotional interviews on Zoom to promote their movies, TV show, music, that sort of thing, that their public relations people, their marketing people are realizing the importance of not doing a bad audio Zoom interview. But I really do think it's preparation beforehand, that if you have an interview scheduled with someone at 1:00, the day before, try to get with them and do a test to see what it sounds like and to offer suggestions. A lot of time it's just like using a plug-in microphone or earbud microphones that will make a world of difference.
Definitely. I work in local news right now, and with the day turn packages that we do, we don't ask anybody to do anything different, and the audio is so atrocious. So I was
Yeah.
just wondering if you had encountered anyone that you thought, well, they have it down pat, and I would give it
Yeah.
a listen. But
Yeah, I would
we're
say
just,
Howard Stern's got it
sounds
down
so
pat.
bad.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
In particular,
That's-
I remember he did an interview with Chris Rock, the comedian,
Yeah.
which I thought sounded so crystal clear. And Chris Rock was in his living room, and Howard Stern was in his apartment in New York City. Did one with Sarah Silverman, which I also thought was done really well. And then another podcast I listened to, Mark Maron, which is a very popular interview podcast. The majority of his are still very tough to listen to, and it's bothersome. It's not bothersome if it's somebody that you're so into that you can't get enough of information from them. But if it's someone that you're like, oh, I'll give this a listen, and you hear bad audio, you want to bail.
Understandable.
Yeah.
That was a good question. Thank you, Alex.
Yes, good question.
Does any?
I also have
does
one
anyone
more
have-
question if no one else does.
Sure.
Just in regards to the finding a niche for your podcast, do you feel like it's possible to get too specific and to be in too small of a subculture or group that you would just find no success with it?
Well, I think that getting too niche, you'd have to start looking ahead. Like, okay, if I was going to start a podcast on this topic, what would my topics be? Because you really want to get into the topics instead of sort of burning through everything in your first podcast, because you're not used to pacing yourself. So I would kind of look ahead to see if I was going to be doing this topic for the next 12 weeks, what would be 12? Could I get 12 topics out of this? And then go from there.
Mhm.
Okay.
But it's no different than when people go
What's
on the
your
radio.
idea?
Yeah, what's your idea?
Well, so I'm a recent cancer survivor. I got diagnosed when I was 22, and I went through treatment until at the end of 2018, 2019. So podcasts and just talking about things that we would be able to talk about for 15 minutes with some semblance of expertise. I'd sort of thought that maybe something in that realm, but then I keep toying with the idea that that's just too broad, because there's a lot of young adult cancer survivors that, might listen to a podcast, and about what specifically. And then I was like, well, the sort of strange nothingness that comes after you finish chemotherapy when you're 24 of what am I doing with my life, that I think a lot of people experience, where you feel like you have to start over. So basically I was thinking about talking about starting over like at a young age, sort of. But then I thought I could scrap that because I like to bake, and just thought I'll talk about baking. So, I'm really all over the place here.
Well, I think your first idea is a really good one, because there's probably a lot of baking podcasts, right? There's entire cable networks about, baking and cooking. I think you have a unique perspective in having come through it yourself. And there are probably other people like yourself who would be in the same boat, or felt like they were in the same boat. And they don't have to be things like, you don't need to be an expert on everything. You can have a curiosity or questions about it, where you find someone to talk to on your podcast that is an expert in it, right? So other people who, when you first come out of chemo, now you have had that experience, but who else has had that experience? And what was it like the first week for somebody versus somebody who that was through that 5 years ago? So I think sometimes, even if you had questions about something that you think would be interesting to cover, if you don't have the answers to that, you could always find people who do have the answers to that and talk to them.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to my little rant there.
Oh, sure.
And answering the question.
Alex, I love the idea. I think that would
It is
make
a
a
good
really
idea.
nice podcast. I mean, you could interview doctors, you could interview other survivors, you could interview people that went through chemotherapy later. You can interview people that went through chemotherapy when they were young and now they're in their 40s. I know people that had cancer when they were young and they're in their 50s now. So, there's a lot of perspective that there's so many things you could talk about. And I think it would be of value. I always like to think, can this thing that I'm creating be of value? Can it help someone else in some way, teach them something, get them excited about something, maybe get out of their head about something? Al, even your podcast with Paul, you had a lot of guys that listened to that podcast that really connected to you both because you were so honest about just these very mundane experiences that maybe guys don't feel comfortable talking about. And so I think
Right.
there's so much we can offer when we're true to who we are. We know what we're passionate about and what we really love and enjoy, and then we can share it. Because at the end of the day, a podcast is work. It really is. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes thought, it takes planning. So it has to be something that you are interested in and excited about and feel like you're doing something good, because you might not get those numbers. It might
Right.
only be 100 people or 200 people, but do the people that you have listening, does it serve them? Do they get value out of it? Are they enjoying it? Are they sharing it? That's where I'm coming from, because I don't think most people in the class are going to create a podcast that will then get them advertisers. Maybe, and that would
Right.
be wonderful. But I don't even know that that's the goal of most podcasts. I think today a lot of people, one, they do it because they want to practice their broadcasting skills. Two, they're just really passionate about a topic, or they're an entrepreneur or micro entrepreneur, and they're trying to promote a business or a product or a service. And as part of that process, they want to provide some type of value. So it's really depends on where you're coming from in the process of, creating the podcast. Of course, this is just for an assignment, but I always like to look at the bigger picture. How can you use this as part of your own personal branding to really connect and promote yourself and your skills?
Right. Even the way you described the two different things, you kind of were passionate about this cancer survivor, or I could just bake, the baking one. Like that right there, you said,
in all fairness, once I start talking about baking, that's when I can do that for very into the baking thing. I think I just do see the fulfillment in terms of value add that, Professor was talking about, of talking to other people, saying, like, we all went through this beep and it was so bad, but let's talk to some other people and talk about how we're making the best of the bad, and the life crisis. And so I thought maybe there would be value add on that, but at the same time, it's just such a small pocket and the market is so saturated with these things. Like, you could search that and there's already 50 podcasts about it.
About
That's not a lot, actually, 50.
Right.
Actually, you could have a really good chance there of breaking through, Alex.
Right. That's true.
Maybe that's not as many. I guess in my head that was a lofty number. I thought, oof, that's a lot of people.
You would immediately be able to say, I'm in the top 50 of these types of podcasts.
That's a really good way to think about it. Yeah.
Well, I could say that about PS Italy. My podcast is in the top 10, 50. Actually top 5 for podcasts about Italy.
That's so cool.
Exactly, for podcasts about Italy. Exactly.
Thanks. Right. Yes, there's not how many are there? But that's a really good question. So, Alin, thanks for joining. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Al.
I was saying we did this with another class either last semester, and these guys were listening about doing something very niche, very specific, and these guys started a podcast where they talk only about the 90s sitcom Seinfeld. Right, that's all they do. They talk about Seinfeld. They want guests who are interested in Seinfeld. Then they were finding people who had one-off roles on Seinfeld that they were memorable for, and they were able to book them as guests because, they were famous for Seinfeld, 20 years ago. And it's really become a fun podcast. They rank the episodes. They talk about what episodes mention food, and they got that from a talk just like this we had. I think it must have been last semester.
I did.
They're already moving along.
Facebook Live.
Yeah, we did Facebook Live, and one of those guys was on there, and they're really moving along. And they have a fun name. They started making coffee. I was a guest on their podcast. They sent me a mug with their podcast logo on it. It's very funny, and just watching them interact on Twitter with big accounts. So anytime Barstool tweets anything, they're there with the screen grab or a from a Seinfeld episode that pertains to that somehow. It's unbelievable.
That type of consistency in the response, that I feel like is what gets engagement, because eventually you get enough people that just say, these guys are always making Seinfeld jokes, and then they go check it out and they follow it. So I approve of that strategy.
Yeah, but they're interacting with accounts that have big interaction. So like anything Barstool Sports is a ton of interaction. So, but it's funny to see, or if anytime Jerry Seinfeld tweets something, they've got a response, and it's always a fun a video or quick shot of Seinfeld that's very relatable to the topic. They're not just throwing things out there, like it's so specific that you forget, like, oh my God, that's a brilliant response to that. But it takes a lot of work. Like I said, anytime I see anything, they're there. So I'm like, are these guys constantly on Twitter looking for Seinfeld references that they can respond? And the answer is probably yes.
And that came from a statement that Al made in the live last semester when you said 2 guys sitting down and talking about their lives is not a podcast.
Right. 2 guys.
They were going to start a podcast.
Right. Like 2 guys, like just because you and your friends, when you get together, everybody's laughing and having a good time. Is that interesting to someone who doesn't know who you are? And those 2 guys talking about sports, it's probably not interesting. But if I love Seinfeld, I would check that out. But and they're so into it, and there's enough there that they can do something every week. Or at least we hope. Even if they themselves run out of material, they find people and ask them to come on just to talk about Seinfeld. So they're not going to ask them any other questions. Rapport? They do. Now, it was on like a Zoom type of situation when I did it because of where we're at with the coronavirus and all. But I thought they did a great job. They grew up together, so they have a natural chemistry. But yeah, they started then they just started finding, more like local, like radio guys that, like, they had me on, they have other guys from the radio station that have not a huge social media following, but bigger than a regular person that will then promote that I was on this podcast. And little by little they are getting their stuff out there.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Does anyone else have any questions for Al? We're coming up on our time now.
All right.
Anyone?
Can I ask one?
Oh, yes, please do.
Oh, okay. I am kind of interested in the process of booking guests. Like, it's you or your team, how you did that. Do you send emails or through phones?
Yeah.
I don't know if it's complicated or
it is. It is complicated. It's complicated if you're trying to reach out to somebody who it really depends on what your podcast would be. So the toughest people to book are like real celebrities, right? So anybody who's got a huge social media following. But what I've watched these Seinfeld guys do is they tweet at somebody and say, hey, like they'll say, hey, it looks like you like Seinfeld. You want to come on and talk about your favorite episode? And I've seen them get people that way. Other people use the direct messages on social media. If you're doing something like Alex was mentioning potentially doing a podcast about coming out of chemotherapy. If she was interested in talking to a doctor who worked at one of the cancer hospitals, you could a lot of times go on those websites and find a contact to email somebody. So it really depends on who the person is you're trying to book as a guest, either going right to their website, right to their social media. If you can't direct message them on social media, then just writing to them on social media and tagging them, hopes that they see it or read it. But yeah, it's not easy. It's not an easy thing to do. That's why it's hard to consistently depend on guests in order to it's a lot of pressure every week to go, oh my gosh, I don't have anybody for next week. How do I go about getting somebody?
Yes. I think that would be super embarrassed if I don't have anyone for my next episode.
Yeah, it gets scary because you think, oh my gosh, I have to have something here. What am I going to do?
Yeah, that's true. Thank you for sharing
You're
your
welcome.
experiences.
Thank you.
That was an excellent question. Well, Al, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to
Oh,
join
yeah.
my class. You know, I really always appreciate your support, and I
You
hope
got
the
it.
students enjoy hearing it. You have so much experience. And I love when you talk about it because it's just, to me, it's just fascinating. You're in the thick of the media industry. You see what's happening every day. You've seen how it's changed. You see how it's changing. And your perspective is really very valuable. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I want to thank all the students that joined today. Very great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Okay,
you.
bye.
Take
Bye,
care. Bye.
everyone.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Bye.
Thanks.